Secretary Baker, is it the United States posture to try to jawbone a private company, Total, when it engages in a $2 billion enterprise effort with the government of Iran, simply because Washington does not like Iranian policies?
Are you asking me, Bernie, if that's a United States policy, or are you asking me if that what the policy should be?
Both.
It's what the United States policy today is. It's a policy that was formulated in large part from the Congress. There's legislation on the books that that gives the president the power to sanction companies that make an investment of in excess of $40 million with Iran, but it gives the president some discretion. He's got some national security discretion there not to sanction. I'll tell you what my own personal view is here. I haven't seen evidence yet that Iran is changing. I totally agree with what Chris just said about that. Doesn't mean we ought not to look for evidence. There is a new president there. He is allegedly a moderate. At least he was more moderate than the person he was running against, but I don't think he's going to call the shots in Iran. I think the shots are going to be called by the Ayatollahs. And so far we haven't seen any indications of moderation in behavior. There is no country in the world that supports to a greater extent, in my opinion, state-sponsored terrorism than Iran. As Chris has pointed out, they are implacable foes of the Middle East peace process. They've done everything in the world they could to subvert that process. They used to take Americans and Westerners hostage in Lebanon and hold them, kill some of them and hold others. And so I think we ought to be very, very firm in our reaction. Now, the whole question of extraterritoriality of U.S. sanctions is a very, very difficult question. If you check, again, if you check the Times this morning, you'll see where it's presenting quite a problem with respect to the some financial issues. But I don't see anything wrong with sanctioning a country, and I frankly, even as a former Secretary of State, don't have a lot of difficulty with extraterritoriality where the vice that we are trying to combat and defeat is something as pernicious as state-sponsored terrorism. If we can't get our allies to go along with us, then I think there's nothing wrong with telling a French company that wants to trade with a country that is doing this, telling them, you got a choice. You can trade with Iran, or you can trade with the United States of America. Take your pick. In most instances, they'll pick the United States of America. Now, Total might not, because it doesn't have any investments here, but most countries will. That's the way I feel about it.
I support what Jim Baker had just said. I just would like to point out one additional thing. We keep talking about, people keep talking about moderation in Iran. It is quite possible that the new president will be more moderate in economic policy, and it is also possible that he will purchase this by continuing his ideological campaign in foreign policy to keep the Ayatollahs on his side. So I think the correct American policy is to let Iran know, as Chris pointed out, that we're willing to have a dialogue, but to gear our actions to their actions and not to our psychiatric analysis of the mentality of the new president.
Secretary Kissinger, why should the American taxpayer, to the tune of roughly $3 billion in foreign aid, support the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when secret agents of his government are about the streets of Amman trying to assassinate people?
The conflict, I mean, what is going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians in that battle, when Israelis get blown up in the streets and I don't know, 120 people have been killed in suicide bombing organized by types like the fellow they tried to assassinate in Amman. I cannot get excessively excited about the moral issue involved here. I think the stupidity of doing it in this manner, or doing anything in this manner, our concern in the Arab-Israeli dispute, the thing we have to decide is what pressures will the American government, not because of that one issue, what is the role of the American government in facilitating negotiations between Arab and Israelis? And I think we have to understand that no progress is possible unless we are willing to suffer some pain, because both parties are going to blame us and are going to shove difficult decisions to us. And we also have to balance not driving the various parties to absolute despair by taking sanctions. So I have no problem with continuing to give economic aid to Israel. I do have a problem with the fact that at some point the United States has to enter these negotiations. When Jim Baker organized the Madrid conference, there were people on both sides, especially also on the Israeli side, who were very dubious about the process, who are now grateful that the process was started. And this is the specific role of America, to try to be an honest broker between the two sides and recognize that this is not painless. This is not something in which suddenly an agreement materializes and you can announce it on the White House lawn. That is the question we should address, not how we react to an individual act in this miserable war of terrorists and anti-terrorists.
Bernie, adding just a little bit to what Henry said, because I agree with everything he said. It was stupid and dumb to do what was done or attempted to be done in Jordan. But it was stupid because it had the potential of undermining King Hussein, who is one of the foremost Arab leaders leaning toward peace with Israel. And Israel enjoys now a relatively warm peace with Jordan, and this stupid maneuver puts that warm peace at risk. You're not going to get anywhere in the Middle East, in my opinion, unless you're willing to take some heat from both sides. Both sides have things they need to do. The Arabs, Arafat in particular, needs to be a heck of a lot more diligent with respect to terrorism. But the Israeli side as well should really do what Secretary Albright has asked very politely. Please give us a timeout on settlement activity. Settlement activity is the most destructive thing to the Middle East peace process, except for terrorism. And what's really required is for the Arabs to be more diligent on terrorism and the Israelis to stop building these settlements, which basically foreclose any opportunity to negotiate on the basis of United Nations resolutions 242 and 338. The only time the United States has ever made any real progress over there is when we are willing to take a lot of heat. Henry took it in the disengagement agreements. Cy Vance took it with respect to Camp David. We sure took it with respect to Madrid, and look what Madrid has produced. It's produced a peace between Israel and Jordan, and it's produced a process that at least is continuing in a way between Israel and the Palestinians. Chris certainly took it by making the efforts that he made, and you have to be willing to do that, or you're not going to see any results.
Really echoing the comments of both Henry and Jim, we must remember how far we've come in the Middle East. It was not too long ago that every Arab nation in the Middle East was an implacable foe of Israel. Now there's peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, and tremendous progress in the Palestinian sector, even though it's hard to realize. Of course, you have Gaza and Jericho, and you have now 9 West Bank cities where the Palestinians have self-rule. And what we've not talked about here yet is the economic dimension of peace. There have been 4 conferences in the Middle East, or there will have been by the end of this year, I hope, where Israelis and Arab businessmen, with businessmen from all around the world participating, are beginning to do very important trade and investment deals. More countries now have diplomatic relations with Israel than ever before. So there's a good deal of progress, and we just need to be persistent about it. Persistence really is the absolutely key to progress in the search for peace. You have to be tenacious about it. You have to realize that progress comes sometimes at unexpected moments, but the United States, as both of my colleagues have said, have to be in there, weighing in an appropriate way, but nevertheless indicating what our vital stake is in the Middle East and how we think those problems should be resolved.
Mr. Kissinger.
I'd like to point out that in the Middle East negotiations, we are at a philosophical divide similar to the one that I said we reached in our national policy about 25 years ago. And it is this: all of us here, and since 1973, have been pursuing what was called the step-by-step approach. We thought that by little steps at a time, we would create a better atmosphere for an ultimate negotiation. And I think that was very successful, and it had the results that Chris has pointed out. Now we are at the end of that approach because there are not too many little steps left. I think there are only a few fundamental issues left: borders for Israel, creation of a Palestinian state, future of the settlements, and Jerusalem. I think Jerusalem ought to be put aside, but all the other issues ought to be attempted to be settled in one comprehensive negotiation. And I think this is where the United States could come forward with at least some principles to give the parties something to repair to, to argue whether the next slice of Israeli withdrawal should be 10% or 12% or 9%. That is too esoteric to frame a negotiation around. But to decide what should the borders be, will there be a Palestinian state, which the Israelis have not yet accepted? What will happen to settlements? Those are fundamental issues, and they all should be wrapped, in my view, into one negotiation.
Do you want some disagreement up here? We've been agreeing with everybody, with each other all the time. Let me disagree with Henry's suggestion that we go immediately to final status discussions. I do not think there is a snowball's chance in hell that those would succeed if we can't make the agreements that have already been negotiated and signed, sealed, and delivered. If we cannot take those steps and make that succeed, it's just a difference, I suppose, in approach. But let me say, Bernie, that I think it's important to make clear there is no moral equivalency here between bombs and bulldozers. The point Henry made earlier is absolutely right. You cannot expect Israel to negotiate seriously under a land for peace formula when innocent Israeli women, children, and citizens are being blown up in the marketplace in Jerusalem. At the same time, it's very difficult to see how the Palestinians are going to be able to negotiate seriously at the very time that the bulldozers are confiscating Palestinian land and building further Israeli settlements. I think we ought to keep on the step-by-step approach that was laid out originally in Madrid and then in the Oslo Peace Conference. And the day will come when there's a new dynamic for peace, in my opinion. It may take a change of leadership on both sides. But there's no going back. There is no going back because the Israeli body politic wants peace, and the majority of the Arabs with whom they're negotiating want peace.
Secretary Baker, you say the day will come when there's a new dynamic, but Mr. Christopher, could you start off, please, and go rapidly because we have more territory to cover. Could you start off by explaining why United States foreign policy makers have coddled King Hafez al-Assad of Syria?
Well, I have to begin by disputing the premise of your question. Syria is on both our terrorism list and our narcotics list, which effectively rules out any trade relations with them, and we have very, very limited relationships with Syria. But Syria has indicated it is made a critical choice for peace, and in view of that, I think we need to test that and find out if they are prepared really to seek peace. Syria is not in the same category of some others who really have been denouncing the peace process. It's been in part part of the peace process, but we're certainly not coddling Assad. Nevertheless, we see there an opportunity to end the strategic threat that Syria has been to Israel. Syria and Israel have a difficult border that Secretary Kissinger played such a very important role in pacifying for a time, but I think that a peace treaty between those two countries, which are in a technical state of war, would be in the interest of both countries as well as in the interest of the world as a whole. So, Bernie, I guess what I would say, you can talk to people without coddling them. I think talking with people who have indicated some desire for peace is always well worthwhile.
Bernie, I agree with what Chris has said. I don't think any American administration has coddled Hafez al-Assad or Syria. Let me say to you that there absolutely would never have been a Madrid conference had Syria not changed what had been 25-year Arab policy of refusing to even talk with Israel. And we got the Arab side to make that significant change, which enabled us to have the Madrid conference. We got them to agree to that because we went to Damascus and we sat down and spent endless hours. As both of my colleagues here will tell you, you spend endless hours anytime you meet with President Assad, and we spent endless hours meeting with him. But it was only because we did that we were able to get to Madrid. And you're just not ever going to have a comprehensive peace between Israel and the Arabs until you get to peace between Israel and Syria.
It used to be, the Israelis used to say, there can't be an Arab war without Egypt, and there can't be a peace without Syria. And I think both of these principles are right. In the period in which I negotiated, I made the same experience as Jim did, which is that Assad is a complicated fellow. I once brought him a letter of invitation to the Geneva Conference, which was our equivalent, and he accepted it immediately, which is not his character. So I said, "There's something I forgot to ask you that I should have asked you." He said, "As a matter of fact, you did. It's something you forgot to ask me." I said, "What is it?" He said, "You didn't ask me whether I'm going to the conference." I said, "Are you going?" He said, "No." So he didn't care what I said, but he didn't go, but he didn't block it, and he made it possible for the others. So just as the peace process in Jim's period started with Syrian participation, it started in the period in which I was Secretary of State with Syrian toleration, and it would not have been possible. So sooner or later, there is no way to have a peace process in the Middle East that does not include Syria in some way.
Gentlemen, we now go from the Middle East to this hemisphere. Our country is rapidly becoming a more ethically diverse society, ethnically. Americans of Hispanic and Asian heritage in particular represent an ever larger share of our population. Sometime in the next century, non-Hispanic whites will represent less than half of the American population. The President of the United States currently is on tour in South America. He's in Brazil, the most economically powerful country in South America. But there's been a perennial, seemingly, turning of the back on Latin America, South America. How will the changing population, ethnic population, in the United States affect U.S. foreign policy? Anyone?
Since I reside in a state where the Hispanic population is growing very rapidly and is, I think in the city of Los Angeles now, is coming up, may soon be in the high numbers in that city. I think it's correct the Los Angeles School District has more Hispanics in its district than any other ethnic group. So clearly there will be a political power in the hands of the Hispanics, which I think will tend to have its effect over time on American foreign policy in that intersection that there always is between politics and foreign policy. But Bernie, I think there's a deeper reason why South America is going to be important to us than that. I think that's a long-term trend, and that is the tremendous importance of South America to us in both economic and political terms. I have to contrast the time when I was Deputy Secretary of State in the Carter administration with the time that I just finished 4 years with President Clinton. In the earlier time, South America was governed in many respects by military dictatorships. Coups were fairly frequent there. The quality of government there was relatively low, and their economies were very backward. Now we have every country in the Western Hemisphere except Cuba a functioning democracy. We have tremendous progress on the economic front, and so I think rivaling Southeast Asia, and in some ways a good deal more attractive than Southeast Asia, Latin America is a tremendous market for the United States. Its political support for the United States is exceedingly important. There's just been a sea change in attitudes in South America, where they used to, I think, enjoy putting pins in us. Now they enjoy supporting us. That particularly is true of the two most powerful countries in South and Latin America, Brazil and Argentina. Now the relationships, as you can see from President Clinton's visit this week, are warm relationships. So I think that's fundamental support in both an economic and political area is likely to be the future of our relations with South America.
Mr. Kissinger.
I think the second point that Chris made is more important than the first point. We should not conduct our foreign policy primarily on the basis of the ethnic composition of our population, but on the basis of a national interest that includes everybody. But the second point that Chris made about the cooperation of democracies, the Western Hemisphere is the ideal place where this unity should be demonstrated. And I would like to point out one thing. We have been a little slow in pursuing the promise of the free trade area for the Americas that was put forward at the Miami summit by President Clinton. And in the process of delaying putting forward the fast track and others, Brazil is organizing something called Mercosur. They're doing it in the charming Brazilian manner, and it's almost painless. But the fact is they are organizing a common market in Latin America in which the United States does not participate. The first time such a structure has existed in the Western Hemisphere. And if this trend continues, we will find the Western Hemisphere for the first time divided. So it is essential that the negotiations start between NAFTA and Mercosur, and that we go to this free trade area for the Americas before our neglect due to our domestic difficulties creates a schism in the Western Hemisphere, which we will regret.
Sadly, Bernie, we have waited too long. We have waited too long to submit fast track to the Congress. We did so because we had, in part, we did so because we had an election in 1996, and this is a very difficult, politically sensitive issue. Hopefully we'll win fast track, and I know a lot of Republicans will be supporting the efforts, as we've said before. I couldn't agree more with Henry when he says we should not base our foreign policy on the basis of ethnic background and ethnic considerations. That is probably the most important distinguishing characteristic of this country from other countries. We are not we do not base our policies on the ethnic background of all the people that make up this wonderful melting pot called America. Why? Because we are first and foremost Americans. We are brought together and we are kept together by our fundamental belief in a number of very important principles and values. That's what it means to be an American. Now, does it mean, because we have an ethnic progression in the direction your question suggests, does that mean we'll pay more attention to South America, Latin America? Maybe it does mean that, and if so, that's all to the good, for the reason that Henry pointed out. If we don't get fast track, and if we don't go forward with a hemispheric free trade zone, you can bet your life that the South American countries will be cutting their own deals with Asia and with Europe in short order, and we'll be left out.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, maybe we have something we can disagree on a little bit, although not very much. My view is that for the last 2 decades we've been ignoring Latin America much more than we should. And one of the reasons we've been ignoring Latin America is the almost total lack of Hispanic representation in the Congress. That is beginning to grow, and I don't think it's an unhealthy thing for Hispanic representatives to point out to us the importance of our relationships across the border into Mexico and down into Latin America. Frankly, I think the neglect of Latin America has been a function of our foreign policy, perhaps caused by a number of factors, but certainly in the future I think we're going to have leading political figures calling our attention to that, and I don't think, this being a democracy, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Is the United States at long last discovering Africa?
Discovering Africa? Not in my view. We worked extensively with respect to the problems of South Africa when I was in the government. Are we discovering the problems that beset Central Africa today? Yes, we are, sadly. But again, it gets back to the points that I've made in my opening comments, Bernie. We need to find a way to assess the national interest with respect to those areas of the world where it is important for the United States to involve itself and to engage, and particularly when we talk about sending peacekeeping forces or military engagement. We must determine the national interest, and then we must apply our principles and values to that. Our principles and values, one of those, of course, would be we ought to do everything we can to prevent genocide. We ought to do everything we can to prevent human misery and suffering that is occasioned by those kinds of conflicts in the center of Africa today. But unfortunately, we cannot conduct foreign policy on the principles of Mother Teresa. That's sad, but it's true. And it's not my quote, it's somebody else's, but I think it's apt. So we have to take a look at each and every one of these circumstances. We went into Somalia in a humanitarian way. We saved literally hundreds of thousands of lives there. And then we began to do a little nation building in Somalia, and we lost 19 brave Americans, and we had to turn tail and run. So we got to be very careful when we jump off here and get into a country.
Mr. Kissinger, before I move on to another subject, did you want to make a comment?
Not particularly, but I don't want to ever admit that I...
Let us continue then, because let us continue. Mr. Christopher.
I agree with Jim that we need to always ask where our vital interests are, but Africa is a huge continent with a number of different things going on. We quite often forget that North Africa, that strip across North Africa, is an extremely important area with Egypt and Libya, Algeria, Morocco, where Secretary Baker has just performed another very strong diplomatic feat. I think that our relationships there have been critical. Our relationships in Southern Africa, of course, are always very important to us, and there's good news in Southern Africa, the emergence of democracies and some peer group pressure in Southern Africa. So I think the United States will always be concerned about Africa for humanitarian reasons, but also from time to time for geopolitical reasons. We shouldn't lump the whole continent in a single bag and push it to one side. It's far more important to us than that in the long pull. It's one of the challenges of being Secretary of State is to try to keep your eye all around the horizon, to go 360 degrees every day to try to make sure that some problem doesn't come up and threaten the national interest before you've had an opportunity to address it.
People in this audience have been listening very intently to what each of you has had to say. People in the C-SPAN audience have been listening very intently. You've used the word trade, by my count, at least 45 times on this stage. And yet, the United States' largest trading partner lies northward, Canada. Very little is made of Canada, and in this nation's foreign policy, relatively little is said. Why does the United States government take Canada for granted?
Who do you want to answer the
You can go first.
Again, like Chris did earlier, Bernie, I would respectfully disagree with the hypothesis of the question. We don't take Canada for granted. At least we didn't when I was there, and I'm sure we didn't when my colleagues were there. The fact of the matter is we have excellent relationships with Canada on the whole, and there aren't many problems to deal with. We now have a few little trade irritants involving salmon and timber and a few other things in the Pacific Northwest, but you know, the predecessor agreement to NAFTA was the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Agreement negotiated in 1987. I was a part of that when I was at Treasury. The best thing I think we can do with respect to U.S.-Canadian relations is to remember that they're our biggest trading partner, remember that they are our open border to the north, do whatever we can to bring about this hemispheric free trade zone that President Clinton has talked about. Canada is for that. In fact, Canada, if we don't move forward again, Canada would have every reason to want to move on their own. That would focus attention in Canada on the importance of hemispheric cooperation and away from such difficult issues as, for instance, the secession of Quebec. But I think our relationship with Canada is in excellent shape.
If I could get from each of you a two-sentence response to this question. Beginning with you, Secretary Kissinger. 2 sentences. Why is a containment policy of China stupid?
Two sentences for me at 20 minutes. If China becomes aggressive, then containment may be necessary. But it is essential to see whether we can establish a cooperative relationship with China, where China helps solve issues such as Korea, Cambodia, and Taiwan, where it does not contribute to tensions in the area, and to declare somebody an enemy who does not want to be an enemy, and thereby make him an enemy, that is stupid.
It may or may not be stupid, Bernie. I think it is stupid. You'll get a debate about that. But at the best, it is dangerously premature for us to talk about containing China. When we talk about containing China, in my opinion, we are looking for an enemy. And the best way to find an enemy, as I have said before, is to look for one.
The containment of China is not in our national interest because we need Chinese assistance in dealing with some of the problems of Asia and the world, and dealing with such issues as proliferation. We certainly had their help and benefited from it on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and on the Test Ban Treaty. Two, the advocates of containment sometimes think that in that way we can improve the human rights conditions in China, but exactly the opposite will result, because history shows that the most repressive periods in Chinese history are when they're isolated and contained.
Very shortly, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev will be on this stage. And thinking pre-Gorbachev, gentlemen, is there an old Russia lurking under the new Russia? Mr. Baker.
And not in my opinion, Bernie, at least not now. If by old Russia you mean a Russia that returns to a communist model, I think communism is a philosophy that is probably as dead as the divine right of kings today. So we're not going to see that. We may see a virulent form of Russian nationalism, depending on how we respond to what's going on in Russia today, depending on how we handle some of these challenges that we've talked about earlier this morning. So I don't see it happening, provided the West handles the relationship in the way in which we should. Now, you said there's too much agreement here among this panel, so I'm going to say something that I know Henry disagrees with, and I don't know about Chris, but in my view, when we talk about expanding the North Atlantic Alliance, we should take great pains to make it very clear that we're not talking about doing that because we fear Russia as an enemy, or Russia today is not a military threat to Western Europe, and we need to make very clear to the Russian people and the Russian military that NATO expansion is to promote peace and stability in an area of conflict, the center of Europe, and it's not directed against the Russians. And I, for one, would even go further and say, and this is where Henry will disagree with me, that given the political character of the North Atlantic Alliance, we should never rule out the possibility that Russia herself, if she stays on a democratic course and on a free market course, could one day be eligible to join an alliance, the primary mission of which was to promote peace and stability on the Eurasian continent.
Mr. Kissinger.
There are two types of Russia that could be theoretically lurking. One is the communist one, and the other is the traditional Russia of Tsarism, nationalism, expansionism. Communism is dead. The growth of the emergence of a nationalist, Tsarist Russia, type Russia, is not impossible. It can be ameliorated by American policy, but it cannot be entirely affected by American policy. And so this is something I favor giving Russia every incentive to participate in the international system and to become an honorable member of it. I do not believe that including Russia in NATO is the way to do that. NATO is a defensive alliance, and once you include Russia into it, it has changed its character completely. If we want to create a political system for the evolution of Eurasia, certainly Russia should be part of it. But to have a military alliance with Russia and thereby project the borders of NATO into the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Far East, that is something that would so change the character of NATO that you can no longer call it NATO. That would be a different institution altogether.
Mr. Christopher, we give you the last word.
Essentially, I agree with Secretary Baker's viewpoint on this. NATO is evolving. Its mission, as I said in my statement, is more likely to be concerned about the interests of its members rather than the defense of territory. But it's a long evolutionary pull. We have three nations that are designated to be the first to come in, some difficult preparation on their part, and then we can move forward to next steps. But one thing that I would say, based upon my experience, is that it's very important to be firm with Russia in pursuing matters of our own national interest. We felt the expansion of NATO was in our national interest. Many said that Russia would really rise up if we continued down that course, but we continued down that course, told them we were going to do it in an open way, and offered them an opportunity to have a special relationship with NATO, which they now have. And I think that Secretary Baker carried out a similar policy on East Germany, when many said that if there was an incorporation of East Germany into West Germany, that would present insuperable problems with Russia. But we followed a steady course, and I think that's what we should follow here, remembering always that what our main concern is the United States national interest.
Bernie, can I just add one thing to this discussion? We've talked a lot about the importance of the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to promote peace and stability in Central Europe. And that's important because that's, after all, where we're the players and major players in NATO. But what really ought to happen as well, and every bit as important, if not more important, is that the European Union should open its doors to these countries from an economic and trade standpoint and bring them into the system so that they can participate, not just through a security alliance, but through the economic and financial and market alliance of the European Union. And we need to press the Europeans to do this.
I would just ask rhetorically, is your optimism justified given the problems with the effort toward monetary union?
Well, I think we can be, I didn't say I was optimistic. I said we need to press the Europeans to bring these Central European countries into the European Union. That's a different issue than whether or not Europe gets to monetary union. My own view of that, and I'd be interested in the views of my colleagues here, my own view is they will get to monetary union of a sort, but they'll get there by slipping the standards that they have laid out there for monetary union. Monetary union now has such a political imperative behind it that they almost have to get there. So I think they'll get there, but they're going to do some very creative accounting in order to get there. And what this is going to do is result in a euro, the European currency, which is going to be a softer currency than the Deutsche. We've talked a lot about the importance of the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to promote peace and stability in Central Europe. And that's important because that's, after all, where we're the players and major players in NATO. But what really ought to happen as well, and every bit as important, if not more important, is that the European Union should open its doors to these countries from an economic and trade standpoint and bring them into the system so that they can participate, not just through a security alliance, but through the economic and financial and market alliance of the European Union. And we need to press the Europeans to do this.
I would just ask rhetorically, is your optimism justified given the problems with the effort toward monetary union?
Well, I think we can be, I didn't say I was optimistic. I said we need to press the Europeans to bring these Central European countries into the European Union. That's a different issue than whether or not Europe gets to monetary union. My own view of that, and I'd be interested in the views of my colleagues here, my own view is they will get to monetary union of a sort, but they'll get there by slipping the standards that they have laid out there for monetary union. Monetary union now has such a political imperative behind it that they almost have to get there. So I think they'll get there, but they're going to do some very creative accounting in order to get there. And what this is going to do is result in a euro, the European currency, which is going to be a softer currency than the Deutschmark. So if we're really observant and we watch this debate unfold and we watch the votes being taken, we'd be smart to go out and buy dollars, in my opinion, which won't help the U.S. trade deficit, but it would be a good investment.
The euro, I agree, is almost certain to come into being. I'd say nearly certain. The real problem will arise not in creating the euro, but what will happen afterwards, because the fiscal policies of the European countries are at enormous variance with each other. And how you can have a common currency with different fiscal policies in each country is something that nobody has as yet paid sufficient attention to. They want to create a central bank that is entirely freestanding. Such a thing has never existed before in history, a bank that has no political institutions to balance it, so that I think the real problems of the euro will happen after it comes into being and not in the process of its coming into being. Secondly, once a united Europe exists, there is a crucial decision that they need to make, which is how will they define their identity? The French point of view would be that they should define their identity in some degree in opposition to the United States. Another point of view would be to have an identity in cooperation with the United States, and that would be a very fateful decision, because whether you can incorporate Russia, the only disagreement I have with Jim on that is whether it should be through a military institution or through a political institution. And I would think through a political institution. But whether that can be done effectively depends on whether Europe and Western Europe and the United States work together, because if there is a conflict between us, then all kinds of maneuvers open up for various alignments. That is the fateful decision that they'll have to make after the euro comes into being, and this is where I would like to see, if Britain could begin to join it, it would be a more comforting institution than if France is the dominant factor.
I have been writing notes, and people in the audience here at Rice University have been writing too. They've been writing questions. Mr. Christopher, did you want to make a comment before we pause for a moment?
The euro is such a mego issue that I really don't think I'll comment. Mego means my eyes glaze over. Unless I'm talking to investment bankers in New York and talk about the euro, I find a certain glazing. So I think we ought to get to the audience's questions.
Well, out of consideration for attention spans and people's physical comfort, before we get to the questions, we're going to pause for a few moments. And we ask that people in the auditorium please stand in place because of security concerns. And just stretch for a moment, and we'll come right back, and we'll go to as many of your questions as is humanly possible. We'll be right back.
Rooms are overflowed, and see it. Bernie, back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, before submitting your questions to these gentlemen of skill and courageous dedication to country and cause, please permit this reporter a few personal observations. If each of these diplomats on this stage gave full voice to what they know, we would be drunk from revelation. Each has experienced high purpose polluted by politics abroad and at home. Each has served at the pleasure of a president. Each has absorbed blame, due and undue. Each has known those two opposite impostors, triumph and disaster. These gentlemen more than served, they gave beyond what they thought they had. Cyrus Vance, who is not here with us today, Henry Kissinger, Warren Christopher, and James Baker have walked history's sands, and now they can look back, satisfied that the shoreline is still there, and we thank them. To James Baker, are you sorry you never ran for president?
No. You wanted short answers. The short answer is no. Bernie, before you go on, though, may I just say one thing that doesn't have anything to do with politics? We were talking about European Union a minute ago before the break, and we were talking about European Monetary Union, and Chris quite rightly said it's one of these issues that makes your eyes glaze over, but European political union doesn't make your eyes glaze over. And I think it's important to make the distinction that what we were talking about there was monetary currency union. My own view is that European political union isn't going to happen. Maybe I say that because I was a veteran of the unfolding events in the former Yugoslavia when the United States deferred to Europe's lead there, and we saw the European powers all go off in their old traditional ways. I just wanted to add that to the original comments on European Union.
Well, you're still on the griddle. By the way, we received more than 500 questions, so I'll try to move as briskly as possible. Mr. Baker, couldn't President Bush have intervened earlier and more effectively in Bosnia?
Well, President Bush made the determination, which was fully supported by all of his foreign policy advisors, including myself, that the events in the former Yugoslavia did not rise to the stature of putting the lives of American men and women at risk on the ground. We're in there now. This was a decision made by our successors, the Clinton administration. I think they're doing the best they can with a very difficult situation, but I don't see an exit strategy. If you want me to respond to your question in a little bit partisan fashion, there is no exit strategy that I see. And I worry that we're going to get bogged down in there with this idea that we need to nation build and create a unified or unitary Bosnian state. We know what the consequences of mission creep were in Somalia. I fear for the same thing in Bosnia. But at least we made it clear the way we felt, and we articulated this to the American people, and we said this is not an issue that America has such a national interest in that we ought to put ground troops in there, and we were consistent throughout.
Secretary Christopher, in following up on the subject of NATO and NATO expansion, do you really think that American GI should be prepared to die for the Hungarian border?
Well, NATO has been the most successful alliance in history. As Jim Baker says, it has both military and political aspects. It seems to me extending NATO, extending the democratic push eastward is something that the American people ought to be very much in favor of. The issue is always been whether or not the American troops would go to defense of NATO members. They have been committed to this for a long time. It's been very much in our national interest, and I believe it's in our national interest to include these three additional Central European democracies, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. So yes, just as much as I think American soldiers ought to be prepared to go to the defense of Portugal, I think those three countries have equal significance for the American people. Just remind how important and valuable that alliance has been to keeping the peace that we've had in the 50 post-World War II years.
To Dr. Kissinger, are you Are you the famous deep throat Bob Woodward used during Watergate?
I've never heard that I was supposed to be the deep throat. No, I'm not sure there was a deep throat, but I was not.
Well, my reporter's instinct prompted me to follow up with a question: what makes you doubt that deep throat existed or still exists?
Well, first of all, I have to make, one has to understand how the Nixon White House operated. I had a lot of influence on foreign policy. I was never invited to participate in discussions of domestic policy, luckily. I don't know, I do not have a good command of the universe of who participated in these discussions, but some of the descriptions of how Deep Throat contacted the journalists and how they then met seem to me extremely difficult to imagine. This had to have been a fairly high official in the White House. He then is alleged to have left a marked up copy of the Washington Post on the stoop of either Woodward or Bernstein, which was the signal for them to meet him in an underground garage in Washington. I cannot conceive any senior White House official going through those procedures and surviving. But I didn't know the domestic side. They might have had some very tricky characters there.
You did not know the domestic side, but you knew the foreign policy side. I would like to share, if you don't mind, with our audience, C-SPAN audience in here in the auditorium, the fact that during the recent handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China, I interviewed you at the governor's house as Chris Patton was preparing to withdraw in Hong Kong. And at the time of the interview, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was in North Vietnam, meeting with the very generals who conducted the war, prosecuted the war from the side of the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese. This question from the person in this audience, Dr. Kissinger, is a very simple one. Was the Vietnam War a mistake?
Yes. I think, let me say two things. I believe the Vietnam War was fought for noble causes, for moral reasons, in pursuit of traditional American objectives. What we did not understand properly was that you could not apply the principles that worked in Europe to Asia, that South Vietnam was not a nation in the sense that we had understood a nation to be in Europe. And then it turned out that we were not prepared to pay the price that was necessary to win that war. So I think from that point of view, it was a mistake. I do not, however, agree with Secretary McNamara telling the mothers of the casualties that not only was it a mistake, but he knew all along it was a mistake. That I find very painful, even though McNamara is a personal friend of mine.
If I read faces correctly, the two of you were thinking very, very deeply and almost on an emotional level as Henry Kissinger was speaking. Can you share with us what was going through your minds?
I was wondering if you were going to ask me if I thought the Gulf War was a moral war, and I was going to say yes, absolutely. That's really about all that was going through my mind, Bernie. I was really reflecting back to the earlier deep throat question.
Mr. Christopher.
I was not thinking about the deep throat question. Well, if this is truth and consequence this time, I was thinking about my time when I was Deputy Attorney General in 1967 and 68, when the nation was torn by riots in a number of cities following the death of Martin Luther King and the assassination of Bob Kennedy. And I think sometimes we've forgotten how rent our nation was at that period of time, how divisive Vietnam had turned out to be. Many of those riots had a very strong Vietnam content to them, and I feel so fortunate that we've come past that time and begun to put those memories, at least the worst of them, behind us. There are many valuable lessons that we can draw from the Vietnam War, but our country was severely tested in 1967 and 68 by the riots that tore through 26 of our major cities, and I think a number of people in this audience are certainly much too young to remember that time, but it's a part of our history that reflected the Vietnam War. To be honest with you, that's what's going through my mind, Bernie.
Thank you. Secretary Kissinger, in a follow-up on China, well, I correct myself, this says in a follow-up on China to all, should the United States be prepared to go to war over Taiwan, to go to war with China?
Six American presidents have made clear two principles with respect to Taiwan. One, that we recognize one China, and secondly, that we consider that the problem ought to be solved by peaceful means. I believe that it is possible to navigate between those two extremes. President Clinton moved 2 aircraft carriers when there was a threat, and even though I had some disagreements with the China policy at the time, I supported that move. So I think China would be unwise to challenge us militarily in the Taiwan Straits. We should be careful not to violate in the spirit of the principle of one China and to try to navigate between those two policies.
Secretary Baker.
My view of that, Bernie, is that these same presidents that Henry referred to have followed a policy with respect to what the United States might or might not do in the Taiwan Straits that could best be characterized as a policy of strategic ambiguity. We don't tell anybody what we might do, and I think that's really important. That doesn't mean that policymakers don't know what they would do under a given circumstance. If war should break out, a lot would depend upon the nature of the conflict, how it happened, who was at fault, and all the rest. Before the United States decides that we're going to fight yet another war all the way across the Pacific, we got to be very, very careful. On the other hand, as Henry said, we recognize the People's Republic of China and we de-recognize Taiwan with the express understanding that we expected a peaceful resolution of this problem. And if people will concentrate on substance and not on symbols, like a Declaration of Independence by Taiwan, for instance, if they'll concentrate on substance and not on symbols, if you look at the economic contacts now between Taiwan and China, cross-straits contacts with personnel and investment, this problem will solve itself as a de facto matter if we give it a chance and don't insist upon a de jure solution. But the most important thing is for us to keep people guessing about what the United States might or might not do, because if we say what we'll do, we could invite China's aggressive move against Taiwan, or we might invite Taiwan to declare independence, which would almost certainly trigger a major response from China.
Secretary Christopher.
Those have been two very thoughtful answers, and I have little to add except to say that as we did in 1996, it's very important for the United States to counsel both parties, that is, both China and Taiwan, to avoid provocative acts. What we least need is something that spins out of control that would force that question on us as to what the United States position would be. I think that this is counsel to both parties to make sure that they understand the consequences of their acts and to think hard about their provocations.
Bernie, let me just say, we started this panel discussion out by recognizing that the U.S.-China relationship is extraordinarily important. China is the emerging global superpower. It's darn important that we get it right. And we also talked about how both from the left and the right people are attacking this policy of constructive engagement with China. I think the administration would be well advised to at least consider going up to Capitol Hill and negotiating with the leadership up there, the Republican leadership, a bipartisan accord on policy toward China so that the United States can speak with one voice with respect to this all-important relationship. This is something that we did in the Bush administration in 1989 with respect to Central America, when Central American policy was the most divisive foreign policy domestic political issue. And we took it off the domestic political agenda, then solving the foreign policy issue was quite simple. I think that kind of an approach could pay dividends today.
Republican James Baker, you just urged that the Democratic President, William Jefferson Clinton, go up, to use your words, to Capitol Hill and negotiate a bipartisan accord with respect to China policy. What do you think about this question? Should the Republican leadership, in the form of Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi and House Speaker Newt Gingrich of Georgia, give the President some slack and back away from what the White House views as decidedly partisan sniping attacks in politics?
Are you asking me that just as a general political matter or with respect to foreign policy issues?
Given your pedigree, sir, I mean it on both fronts.
Well, let me give it to you on the foreign policy front. I think I said earlier that we badly need to restore the tradition of bipartisanship in foreign policy. You cannot succeed in foreign policy unless you have domestic political support for your policy. And the only way to really have that domestic political support, generally speaking, is to find a way to generate and engender bipartisanship. I think Secretary Albright said that, and we've mentioned a number of instances where there has been bipartisanship during the course of the Clinton administration. Political conflict and political dialogue and political, the adversarial nature of domestic politics being what it is, I don't think I would counsel the Republican leadership to do anything more or less than the executive branch leadership is doing on the political front. They're having some pretty good head knocking. That's the nature of our system. We believe in free speech, and we believe in people articulating their views and particularly their political position. So as a domestic political matter, I don't have any problem with it at all. I do have a problem with it when it spills over into the foreign policy national interest concerns of the United States. We need to find a way to act as one country with one voice in a unified way on some of these critical foreign policy issues like, for instance, China.
Dr. Kissinger, earlier from this stage, you criticized President Clinton, and you, to paraphrase you, you said that Mr. Clinton looks at polls too much. What are your thoughts now following Secretary Baker's remarks?
Let me first make a point with respect to the last remark of Secretary Baker. The problem, we talk of bipartisanship, but what we really need is quadripartisanship, because every party is so fundamentally divided. I think the most determined opponent that President Clinton has in foreign policy is Representative Gephardt, the minority leader of the Democratic Party in the House, and I think that worries him and the Vice President at least as much as things that the Republican leaders might say. And similarly, the Republicans, if you read some of the Republican weekly journals, are severely divided because some of the Republican right wing want to use foreign policy in order to get control of the party. Now, I do not think I said President Clinton looks at polls so much, but I think he does, so I'll take responsibility for that. But what was your question? Was that a partisan comment, or was that the question, or should he not look at polls so much?
Well, I think I'll move on. You've made your point.
No, my basic view is that the responsibility of a national leader is to show to the American people a vision of where they should go. It is the role of the president to bridge the gap between where we are and where we should go. And whenever a president does that, especially in foreign policy, he has a very good chance of prevailing. And that is what I hope he will do. And as I've said, I support many of the current policies.
Okay, I don't want to get off this subject because you said something that really aroused me. You just singled out a man who potentially could be a rival of Vice President Al Gore when it comes to getting the Democratic Party's nomination. You mentioned Mr. Gephardt of Missouri, but you said he, as a Democrat, was giving President Clinton more difficulty in matters of foreign policy. There's a man from North Carolina who is a Republican who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, whose name is Jesse Helms. Is he an innocent player in the byplay of what's going on?
No, but Jesse Helms has a position that he has always held. I mean, anybody in high office knows what he will be facing from Jesse Helms. And he has a definable constituency. Gephardt is contesting for the presidential nomination, and he is attacking, within a context which is unusual, such a major division within a governing party on the conduct of foreign policy.
I have a question here that's relevant to the conversation. Is there a danger of partisan politics, like campaign finance, diluting nonpartisan foreign policy? Mr. Christopher, if you could lead off responses.
Well, there will always be domestic issues that play a heavy role in our body politic and command a lot of time on your news show and others. I do think that foreign policy will continue to be very important to the American people, especially when dangers arise. Bernie, I do think that there should be greater cooperation between Congress and the White House. I've long advocated a compact between the two so that Congress doesn't get into so much micromanagement of foreign policy. You can see that on the sanctions issues. Congress constantly pressing the administration to agree to sanction one country or another. That's far too much micromanagement. But I don't think that we'll ever be in a situation where we can rule out the significance of the debate on one domestic issue or another. Since I'm talking, Bernie, I think I ought to say that with respect to Congressman Gephardt, although he has marked out sharp differences on one issue, that is the trade issue, and that's historically been his issue as it was in prior times. He has not supported trade agreements and he is not supporting fast track, but on the great bulk of foreign policy issues, Gephardt is, I think, firmly in the Democratic corner. You look at most of the major foreign policy issues, you'll find no difference between him and the White House. There is certainly this one sharp difference on trade issues.
Your response,
Bernie, I would firmly agree with Chris that he's not in the Republican corner, if that's what you mean by firmly in the Democratic corner. But I really think this gets back to what we talked about initially, and that is that we have the left wing of the Democratic Party represented by Dick Gephardt on this all-important issue of, it happens to be fast track now, but it really is an issue of whether America is going to remain engaged with the world and whether we're going to maintain our leadership role. You got Dick Gephardt. You got on the far right side, and we ought not to leave the Republican Party out of this, you got Pat Buchanan, and you got Ross Perot out here as an independent. All of these people are promoting an isolationist, protectionist agenda that would be absolutely disastrous for America. And we need to understand it and recognize it and talk about it.
No, I agree. That is the overwhelming issue right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's time for this last question, and I've been trying to choose which of all these questions to ask our panelists, and because of its import, I have chosen this as the last question. All the others are extremely interesting. Your views on the landmine treaty, would you recommend a career in public service? Why? Dr. Kissinger, as a historian, do you see any useful parallels between this and earlier eras? And the quality of the questions goes on and on. But as a last question, I will quote it verbatim. The military rumblings coming out of North Korea are ominous. What is the strategy that you see as potentially most successful in diffusing this threat? Mr. Baker.
Well, you've put your finger on one where I know there'll be disagreement between my friend Chris and myself, because we've disagreed on this before. I happen to disagree with the administration's entire approach to North Korea. From the date when they turned a policy approach of strength and resolve upside down and went to a policy approach of compromise and negotiation. Because I think North Korea is a regime that is built on force. It only understands force and strength. It understands that very clearly. I don't think it understands accommodation and compromise and negotiation. Chris will tell you why the agreement we worked out is a good agreement. We've had some friendly discussion about this. He hadn't sold me that it's a good agreement, because what I see here is an agreement that obligates the North Koreans to do 5 years from now what they were really obligated to do 2 years ago under their commitments to the international community, and we are giving them billions of dollars in light water nuclear reactors and free 500,000 metric tons of oil a year free, and engaging in diplomatic discourse with them, and so far it hadn't gotten us anywhere. I think they have interpreted it as a sign of weakness on the part of the United States. I know the South Koreans have major difficulties with the approach we've taken, and therefore I think we need to demonstrate resolve, and we need to demonstrate strength. And you know, we kept the peace burning in Western Europe against an overwhelming Soviet conventional weapon superiority for over 40 years. We kept that peace through the strength of our nuclear deterrent. And I think if we conveyed the message to the North Koreans that we have a security treaty with South Korea and we have a security treaty with Japan, and we're committed to keeping the peace in the North Pacific in the very same way, I think they'd get the message.
Mr. Christopher.
Well, Jim is right. We have a disagreement. When we came into office in the beginning of 1993, we found that the North Koreans had a nuclear weapons program, and it was clear that they had achieved enough plutonium to make probably one bomb. They had a program that had the possibility of producing enough plutonium for 5 to 10 bombs a year. That problem had not been addressed when we came into office, and we thought it needed to be addressed urgently. And we adopted an approach toward North Korea, working out finally the accord between the United States and North Korea that has absolutely frozen their nuclear weapons program, and has caused them also to take some of their spent fuel and begin to move it out of the country. So that's what's been accomplished. Freezing that nuclear weapons program is a matter of great importance, and I certainly think that was something that was not done in the prior administration and was done under our administration. Now, we've never let our guard down. We still have 37,000 troops in South Korea. What we've done has been in full consonance with South Korea. The nuclear accord that we reached with North Korea, that is to furnish them light water, less dangerous reactors, is one to which not only the South Koreans subscribe, but basically they're putting up the money for the reactors along with Japan. So we have a program that keeps our guard up, but also freezes their nuclear program, and gives the possibility that we might be able to work out an armistice agreement between North and South Korea. Not many people know that there's been no permanent peace treaty between North and South Korea. They're still acting under an armistice. Now, this is one of those issues on which we've had the cooperation of the Chinese. One of the reasons why Chinese engagement is so important, because they understand the danger of North Korea, but they've been supporting our program, and I think we ought to press forward with four-nation talks, that is, North and South Korea, with the United States and China involved, so as to try to work out a permanent accord with North Korea rather than having that be the one area of hot conflict remaining in the world.
Secretary Kissinger, before you respond, and none of us has any idea what you're going to say, in relation to the subject of North Korea, I'd just like to remind our viewers and listeners, and all of us present here, something you said from this podium about an hour and a half ago when you spoke about the three sets of challenges facing Americans in this great country. You said Asia. The United States is facing something with which we have no experience with, the relationships among Asian countries themselves. Now, sir, the final word from you.
Well, let me, first of all, on the immediate issue of the nuclear issue, I'm basically on the side of Jim Baker. But let me not pursue that. Let me indicate why Korea is relevant to that question you have just put to me. One, it is highly probable that the Korean regime as it now exists is going to face a possibly terminal crisis within the next 5 to 10 years, which could take any number of forms. It could take the form of a military attack. It could take the form of a military coup in which the government is replaced by, obviously, the military. It could take the form of wanting to join the South, and one can imagine any number of other forms. Each one of these possibilities creates extraordinary challenges. First, because of the surrounding countries, Japan, China, Russia, nobody really wants to see Korea unified except the United States and the South Koreans. Because the Japanese, because they're afraid it will be anti-Japanese, the Chinese, because they don't want another strong country at their border. The Russians, I think, would be not necessary. It's not so clear to me what the Russians would want. But the South Koreans are themselves ambivalent about the economic challenges they would face. All I'm saying is that to reconcile these different points of view requires, one, a far-sighted diplomacy now. Secondly, it is absolutely impossible without China. And the people who so easily start a confrontation with China should know that one of the results could easily be a Korean War. So there are many possibilities by which this thing might be resolved in diplomacy, but the worst way to resolve it is to wait for the explosion to happen and then to try to improvise a solution. So Korea is an extraordinarily important test case of what I've said before, our ability to bring together different national interests in that region in a manner that preserves peace and stability and the possibility of progress, and that requires a high degree of cooperation between China and the United States.
We thank you because each of you has given us so much insight, but you've also given us an awful lot to think about. And still to come from this stage and this program, former Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev and the awarding of the Enron Prize. That's coming up very, very shortly. We thank you, gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we prepare the stage for the presentation of the Enron Prize.